Hey guys, this is Kelly Quinn. Thank you so much for coming back to Nonviolence International's YouTube channel. Today I get to introduce you guys to the absolutely inspirational Rafif Jouejati. Rafif is a Syrian-American activist, management consultant, and writer with extensive political and humanitarian experience in Syria. She's the co-founder and director of the Foundation to Restore Equality and Education in Syria and the principal architect of the Syrian Freedom Charter, which has surveyed over 50,000 Syrians on democratic aspirations and political transition. Rafif has been very active in the Syrian women's movement and upholds a commitment to the integral nature of women's rights as a human right. And it is my pleasure to introduce her to you today. Rafif, thank you so much for joining us today. It's really a pleasure and an honor to get to sit with you.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you.
So I know you have a relationship with NVI, so I'm interested to see how you first got involved with the organization.
I met Michael and NVI right after the Syrian revolution started. I met him through a mutual friend, and I was getting involved. I was getting gradually more and more involved in the Syrian uprising, particularly the secular nonviolent movement. And so NVI was a very natural fit. The organization very kindly conducted a couple of trainings for Syrian activists in different nonviolent tactics, civil disobedience, creative civil resistance tactics. And that was extremely helpful, and we've kept in touch. And now what I found out was that Dr. Abdulaziz Saeed, who's affiliated with NVI, had been one of my professors when I was at university. And in fact, he'd been a very good friend of my father's. And so the relationship just sort of came full circle for me.
Right. Wow, that's incredible. I know there's a lot of ties to American University and Washington, D.C. Was your involvement in the Syrian Revolution, was this your first foray into nonviolence activist work, or had you had like a history leading up to this? What sparked you to getting into nonviolent advocacy?
I had been involved in different activist movements in the past. But I wouldn't characterize them as nonviolent movements because those have a more political connotation. I guess it's always political, but I'd been very involved in the movement to have better representation at the Small Business Administration. I'd been involved in Arab American affairs on the Hill. And so I had a little bit of a history of activism, but the Syrian Revolution was really like nothing else I had done. What sparked me, what propelled me to it, was when Bashar al-Assad ordered his troops to open live fire at nonviolent protesters. And that sort of spurred me to action. And so I started getting increasingly involved with different groups on the ground inside Syria. And then it just went from there.
Mm-hmm. So you're the co-founder and director of Free Syria. Can you talk a little bit about that journey, like from the idea of creating it all the way through the implementation and seeing the full realization of that organization?
Sure. So it is Free Syria, and that stands for the Foundation to Restore Equality and Education in Syria. So the mission statement is implicit, but our basic philosophy was we cannot have full equality in Syria unless there's a solid education, and everybody needs to be educated in terms of what human rights are and how those include women's rights. And the reason I say we all needed an education from Syria is because for some 50 years, Syria had been under a military dictatorship. And so the concept of human rights existed only as lip service and not in any actual implementation. And so with my co-founder, we started up this organization. We worked very closely with the local coordination committees in Syria, or the LCC. And at the time, that was the largest network of secular nonviolent activists in Syria. So we worked with them to get funding for different nonviolent initiatives, different training programs, and civil society initiatives in Syria. And so we sort of developed our own capacities along the way. And we've got a couple of very big achievements. One of them is the Freedom Charter project, which actually Nonviolence International helped facilitate. So in that, we developed a survey basically asking Syrians what they want in a future state. And we managed to get more than 50,000 respondents all throughout the country. And I think even till today, it's the largest survey of its kind done in Syria. And perhaps the even bigger accomplishment is that we, with partners, built and are running both a co-ed elementary school in northern Syria and a women's clinic also in northern Syria. And so those are the kinds of projects we undertake.
That's incredible. The Freedom Charter, I'm so glad you brought it up because I was going to ask you about that. It's incredible. I think the way you worded it too on the site is an invitation to dream, which I thought was such an inspirational sentiment.
It still is an invitation to dream because obviously Syria has not achieved freedom. Syrians are still under the boot of that military dictatorship. But now that there are so many Syrians abroad who are learning more and more about what it is to be in relatively democratic societies, I believe that Syrians are starting to unpack the concept of freedom and the concept of democracy, and where, you know, your liberty starts and mine ends. And I think that's an important discussion for us to have. And apparently it's important in the US too, right? So we see that that invitation to dream applies more globally these days.
Anywhere where there's a threat to democracy, this kind of like getting the masses, I like the way you phrased it too. You said architect of your own future, and getting people to take some agency in developing the kind of state that they want to live in. But the Freedom Charter is an amazing document. I was checking it out on your site. So
thank you. Yeah, it is architecting our own future, because among the many problems we've seen in the Syria file is that there's been so much foreign interference, and there have been so many attempts to define who Syrians are. And it's really up to Syrians to determine what they want and who they are and what kind of state they dream of. So the architecture, the use of the term architecting your own future was very, very intentional.
Yeah, and I think spot on. It really requires work and planning and definitely cooperation.
Yes, thanks.
I have a quote here from your site that I would love to read. Is there people more resilient than Syrians? They've faced chemical weapon attacks, barrel bombs, massacres, unspeakable torture, starvation, sieges, and more. Yet at every opportunity, they declare their loyalty to the revolution of freedom, dignity, and equality. That just really struck me. I mean, these atrocities in Syria have been ongoing for so long. And I think the whole global community has been witness to many of that. And, you know, you working so involved in the region, I would love to know what keeps you hopeful, like fighting this fight.
That's a good question. I sometimes wonder myself, right? It's very easy to be discouraged and despondent over what's happening in Syria. You see that the international community has been paralyzed or maybe apathetic or in a coma when it comes to defending human rights in Syria or applying any meaningful pressure on the Assad regime. You see that the regime uses chemical weapons with impunity, imprisons with impunity, and commits unspeakable acts of torture. But what keeps many of us going is the fact that at every opportunity, when the skies are clear and there are no barrel bombs or other bombs raining down on them, Syrians will get out and peacefully protest. And the message is always the same. We want freedom, we want dignity, we want democracy. We do not want this corrupt mafia, torturous government. And, you know, I kind of feel like if people who are living in such awful conditions can go out and protest at every opportunity, who am I to be discouraged? I live in relative peace and comfort, right? And so I'm very grateful to that, but part of that gratitude means trying to represent them or trying to keep the movement going abroad.
What do you If you'd like to continue watching this conversation, please consider following the link in the description for part 2. And as always, please subscribe.